Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Friday morning space show program. And I'm your host for today, David Livingston. Thank you very much for tuning in. Before we start, just a couple of very, very quick announcements. The first one is that our scheduled guest, retired NASA astrophysicist and really terrific person when he was at NASA, Dr. Thomas Zurbuchen, has changed his schedule and will be with us Tuesday morning, July 13th, rather than Monday morning, which leaves open our Tuesday schedule. So if anyone has a suggestion for a last minute upcoming Tuesday program, please let me know. And we'll be doing two programs on June 13th, but July 13th, but more about that as we get closer to that. No show because today is Father's Day. And then the schedule has our upcoming schedule on it. So that will go out with newsletters this weekend. And always guest suggestions are clearly welcome. We appreciate that very much. And moving to today, Andrew Rush is returning to us. He is the co-founder and CEO of Starcatcher. Their website is star-catcher.com. Andrew has a detailed bio on the space show site, but also on his website. He has a very comprehensive bio about all of his credits and his accomplishments, and they're very detailed. But we have an hour with Andrew, so to spend our time focusing on what he's doing rather than reading about what he has done is much more important to me. And Andrew and Starcatcher are working to spearhead the first orbital energy grid. And his plans are pretty detailed on his website. So I would urge everybody to check in with that. Andrew, welcome back to the Space Show. Why don't we start out for people who may not be familiar with you or what you're doing, or even what an orbital energy grid is. Give us the basic introduction, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me back. I was looking back over the years and realized this is the fourth time I've been on the show.
Yeah.
A couple of times with Made in Space, which I was CEO of in the kind of 2010s. It's the first company to manufacture functional objects off the face of the planet. We did 3D printing and whatnot for NASA and others, and then built that up and sold that to Redwire, which of course is a publicly traded space subsystems provider nowadays. When I was chief operating officer of Redwire, we put new solar arrays on the International Space Station, did a lot of work with commercial and other government agencies for power systems, space cameras, and the like. And really, all of my experiences over my career so far, we've been building satellites, building payloads, and we're always constrained by SWaP, size, weight, and power in space operations. And the advent of reusable launch vehicles has really opened the aperture on the size and weight part of the equation. But power is still super, super constrained. Every satellite in space has its own little generator, its own solar arrays to power itself, unlike our modern industrial life on the planet, where we rely on a power grid to give us power. And as a consequence of that, the average satellite in low Earth orbit has about 1,500 watts of power generation on board, which is like as much as my kid's gaming computer uses, or like two NVIDIA high-end GPUs. And what we want to do in space is we want to do direct-to-cell telecommunications. We want to do uh, uh, orbital data centers. We want to do high uptime SAR and other remote sensing applications, but there simply is not the power to do that on board modern spacecraft. And so what we're building at Starcatcher is a solution to that. We're building a network of power beaming satellites, which collect energy from the sun, turn that into a couple of wavelengths of light in the visible and the near infrared part of the spectrum, and then beam that energy to our client satellites' existing solar arrays. They're sort of power gas caps,
Mhm.
if you will, and then use that to increase the amount of power they have available. and give them additional power when they're in eclipse, give them additional power, like supercharge them, and really raise them to the 5 or 10 or 20,000 watts per on average per spacecraft that we really need to kind of meet this next era of space commercialization.
Can you quickly define SAR? I know you use that term and people may
Yeah.
not know what you're talking about.
No, no, I apologize for that. So SAR is synthetic aperture radar. So it's taking radar images of the planet.
So where do you start with what's the beginning point?
Yeah. So our constellation, our power network has really three core subsystems that it relies upon. We have an optical proprietary way that we use to locate the client spacecraft in space. So we don't have to have contemporaneous communication or a beacon or a special receiver on board them for us to find them. So that client satellite acquisition and tracking system is one subsystem. The second is our energy collection system. We use essentially solar concentrators to, in a very low cost and effective way, collect energy that we power our own spacecraft with. And then we have our transmission system, which is a multi-wavelength laser system that uses lasers as the source of the energy, and then we kind of expand that up to about 1.5 meters across spot size and beam that to our client satellites. And so where we've started, and where we started, the last time we spoke, was proving this technology out, proving each one of those subsystems out via terrestrial and early in-space demonstrations, both as subsystems, but then also integrating them together. So last October, we integrated most of that together and beat the DARPA world record for optical power beaming down. We did that down at Cape Canaveral. You can see some really beautiful videos and pictures online of it, where we actually delivered over 1 kilowatt of energy to just off-the-shelf solar arrays. And similarly, we exercised that client satellite acquisition and tracking system, both tracking satellites from the ground to space, so over great distances, as well as exercising those algorithms on orbit on our first demonstration in the fourth quarter of last year.
Who are you looking towards for your customers? How do you actually make money? And what are your chief cost components other than office overhead and things like that?
Yeah, yeah. So this technology is as broadly impactful for satellite operators as reusable launch. The way that we've architected this, it's backward compatible. We can beam energy to satellites they're flying already, whether they're using silicon or gallium arsenide solar arrays. And really, at some point in every satellite's operational life, they could use some additional power, whether that's adapting to seasonality or extending the life of the asset, or if there's some off-nominal event that affects the spacecraft's power system, we can give them some additional power. And then obviously going forward, that supercharging ability. So to date, we have signed letters of intent with over 40 space companies, basically every flavor of space company. So remote sensing folks, orbital data center folks, big primes, small primes, commercial space station operators, telecommunications constellation providers. And then we've also converted 6 or 7 of those to power purchase agreements, where people are paying us deposits to lock in the power rates contemplated for a period of years. So it's really everybody in the space sector from a customer perspective.
Let me
Uh,
ask you another question, and then
sure.
others can jump in if they want. So first of all, are you limited to the quantity of power you can supply? Do you have unlimited supply? And in space, are you subject to ITAR? Can you sell power to foreign satellite owners, even Russia or China? Or do you still have to deal with ITAR?
So the amount of power that we can deliver, it is really driven by each of our power node spacecraft. So each power node has about 100 kilowatts of energy delivery capacity, which is normally spread out over many different satellites. It's a one-to-many kind of architecture. So we have many beams that are each one by themselves, 1 or 2 tons of flux, a couple of kilowatts of energy delivery. And so if somebody says, "Hey, I need 20 kilowatts of my spacecraft. Well, we spread multiple beams out over their solar arrays, and spread that out at the concentration level that their system can handle, like up to like 10 suns of concentration. Now, we as a U.S. company, a U.S. satellite designer, owner, operator, are subject to ITAR. Even when our satellites go to space, we'll still be, that will still be subject to ITAR. And there's plenty of market for us without having to sell into adversarial markets like Russian and Chinese satellites.
John Jossi, you've got your hand up, so go.
Yeah, so Andrew, do the client satellites need to redirect the orientation of their solar panel towards your beam?
No, John, that's a great question. And one of the core premises of Starcatcher and of our Starcatcher network is that our client satellites don't have to have any retrofit or change their concepts of operations, change their orientation. And because it would be a little bit pointless to have a remote sensing satellite that's got to keep its telescope pointed at the ground to say, hey, you need to like rotate 90 degrees to get power from us and point at not the ground and take them out of the mission. So we fly our power nodes at the top of low Earth orbit, so at about 1,500 kilometers in altitude, and that allows us to beam energy down to our client spacecraft and provide them energy without them changing their orientation. So we're basically coming from a sun-facing direction.
Bill?
And this is near infrared uh, power beam.
So one of our key insights, one of the key ways that we are doing power beaming here is transmitting in the wavelengths of light that solar arrays are highly compatible with, which is essentially the visible and the near infrared part of the spectrum. So we have multiple wavelengths in both the near infrared and in the visible that we transmit in.
Why would you need two? I mean, I don't understand why you would be doing two of them, two wavelengths.
So there are two types. There are two types of solar arrays generally used in space. Two chemistries. So there's single junction silicon, and then there's triple junction gallium arsenide. And the gallium arsenide is generally more efficient than the silicon. Silicon has the benefit of being cheaper to manufacture. The silicon cell, you only need to put one wavelength of light on it that's in its where it has a good what we call external quantum efficiency, good efficiency at converting photons into power. So for a silicon cell, you can use anything from like visible to 1100 nanometers or so. For gallium arsenide, for the triple junction cells, you need to forward bias each one of the junctions, and the junctions are in the basically kind of green, kind of red, and then in infrared. So you need multiple wavelengths of light, and if you don't do that, you fry the solar array, and we're not in the business of frying our clients' solar arrays.
Thank you.
Bill, you wanted.
Yeah. So if you recall, SpaceX launched some satellites once, and there was a solar storm, and the satellites couldn't make it into orbit because I guess the atmosphere had been raised a little bit. It strikes me there's a possibility here of using your infrastructure to raise satellites, especially like not just in emergency situations like this, but perhaps in general. The satellites are launched a little bit lower than normal, and therefore that requires slightly less delta V than normal to get them up there. But then you give them a boost with energy to power their solar panels, like supercharge the solar panels to get them up out of the rest of the atmosphere and into orbit. And that potentially could represent a savings in launch costs. That strikes me as maybe a stronger business model than just like providing extra power to the satellites. I was wondering if you consider that business model, and if you'd perhaps run some numbers on it or approached any customers.
Yeah, Phil, it's a great insight. And in fact, we have looked, and one of the use cases that I do get quite excited about is especially with the advent of and proliferation of electric propulsion, we are able to, move things from, very low Earth orbit to higher altitudes. And then, of course, a lot of the geostationary orbit telecommunication satellites have switched to electric propulsion as the way to kind of do their transfer orbit. Historically, so I worked on a mission called Ovzon 3, which was a telecommunications satellite. We built solar arrays for that, and it had two wings, and one of those wings was entirely dedicated to powering the electric propulsion thruster to get it through its GTO to its ultimate orbit. And then after that, they didn't need the array. And so that's a pretty sizable piece of real estate, pretty sizable piece of equipment that if we, to your point, just put more flux on the existing array that they had, they could avoid that upfront spend. They could avoid the complexity and the launch cost and mass associated with it.
If you ever do get to the point where you have a presentation on that idea, I'd love to have you come to the interplanetary infrastructure track at the ISTC and present on it. I'll make maybe next year, because that sounds to me like the kind of thing that we like to talk about at that track. And I think it has potential to change the economics of launch a little bit. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be my pleasure.
Joe, you have a comment?
This sounds a lot like the concept that Overview Energy has, except they're doing it to the ground rather than to other satellites. When you're doing it to other satellites, if you're actually sending more flux onto the solar arrays than the sun does, doesn't that cause a heat dissipation problem for the solar arrays? Because they're not that efficient, right? Especially if you're doing it with an older satellite whose arrays might have degraded. Those things aren't that efficient. So you're going to be putting a lot of energy in there that's going to have to be dissipated by the satellite.
It's a great question. And there's a couple of considerations and factors here. So one is the amount of power we're going to deliver to a given satellite is going to be very mission dependent and very, very design dependent. Some folks that are flying today have power systems that are capable of ingesting a lot more energy because their power system is typically sized for like the largest instantaneous charge and discharge. So the electric propulsion, the compute they might have on board, or the radar payload they might have on board. And similarly, the thermal system is typically designed to accommodate that. But you may have a satellite where somebody says, "Hey, I just want to be at beginning of life power levels, and extend the lifetime of it because everything's fine on my spacecraft except for like my batteries have degraded, my solar panels have degraded a little bit." And so for those folks, we're not putting 10 suns of flux on them. We're going to put half a sun of additional flux on them to keep them power positive. So that in general, that thermal load is manageable. But in addition to that, earlier we were talking about the wavelengths that we transmit in, and we transmit only in those wavelengths that solar arrays are really efficient at converting the photon into power. And that actually gives a really interesting thermal benefit. Because when we talk about a solar array, we'll typically say, "Hey, this solar array is like 25% efficient." When we say that, what we're talking about is how much of the solar spectrum, the entire solar spectrum, that solar array converts into power. So all of AM0. But the reality of the situation is that a solar panel, it's band gap semiconductor, and photons that are over its kind of activation energy, it will convert. The photons that are below it, it doesn't convert at all. It's just wastes heat. So a silicon cell is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, from like 400 nanometers to 11 or 1200 nanometers is like 60-70% efficient at converting those photons into power. But outside of that range, like for the deep IR, it's 0% efficient. So I can actually give that panel the equivalent of a sun of flux by giving it a much lower amount of energy, landing a much lower amount of energy on it, and landing an energy that it converts very readily. So in that way, kind of pound for pound, we're actually more thermally efficient than just putting out larger and larger solar arrays.
Mhm. Um, my question is, we have Rocket Lab, we have Falcon 9, we have Starship, we have Blue Origin, and do you design your system for each rocket, or do you make one design and uh, stack them up to make more of them? And that implies the question of, do you have a lot of little ones or several big ones?
That's a great question. That's a great question, Marshall. So we are baselining a design that can fly multiple spacecraft on a single Falcon 9 class launch vehicle.
Mhm.
So think obviously Falcon 9, think Vulcan. Um, as you've seen with I really love the the images that Amazon Leo has been putting out of showing like, hey, if we procure a launch from Vulcan, we can fit 40 in it. We can procure a launch on New Glenn from Blue Origin, we can fit 70 of them. And I'm getting the numbers wrong, but it's a good example of like
Yeah.
that sort of Tetris that we play. Um, so and Starship is also pretty fascinating here because Starship it's not commercially available yet. And the first Pug that came out had a big clamshell fairing on it, but
Mhm.
all the money, all the only thing we've really seen is the Pez dispenser. And so when that becomes available, how people use that is an exciting but unclear opportunity. Um, and to your question, like, hey, how big are these? They're designed to be not lots of little ones. Just these are more. This each system is about 100 kilowatts to be able to deliver about 100 kilowatts and fly on like a Cape Topper ride share or multiples in a
Mhm.
dedicated launch, as I mentioned.
If a spacecraft has a reason to change orbit, can you supply ongoing power to that spacecraft as it's changing its orbit, or do they have to sort of fill up and have enough power to change orbit without getting ongoing power connections?
You can think of what we're building in space as a power delivery version of a cell phone tower coverage map.
Okay.
That like when you're driving down the highway, the signal's getting handed off from tower to tower as you're going down the highway. And that's the same thing that will happen here. That if a satellite's going from one inclination to another or phasing itself, each of our power nodes has an operational area. And if that overlaps slightly, so if you go out of one operational area, you get picked up by another, and then for them, they're just getting seamless power delivery. They're not having to sort of gas up. That's where the gas station analogy kind of breaks down. It's not really like a gas station. It's more like a consistent energy grid.
What are your leading challenges and bottlenecks? Are they technology that needs to be developed? How do you see the road ahead with tough challenges?
So I really believe that to build a market defining or new technology company, you have to take your big vision and you have to break it down into digestible chunks and like execute those chunks and focus that execution on burning down technical risk, increasing the business case. And so to say that in a different way, we take a very crawl, walk, run approach to both technology development and market maturation. And so we're just kind of executing that, eating the elephant one bite at a time, as it were. Uh, and it's been really amazing, honestly, to see how much customer interest, how much market pull there is for what we're doing. And then also showing via those series of ground demonstrations and then a series of space demonstrations, getting toward operationalization, what where excuse me, where we're headed.
Do you have applications on the moon? Can you beam power down to facilities on the surface of the moon?
So our technology works anywhere in space. Where our go-to the optical power beaming is something that would work to power satellites in low Earth orbit. Would work to power satellites in medium Earth orbit. Or work to power satellites in the geostationary belt. It would work to power satellites in lunar orbit. It would also work to distribute energy from a nuclear reactor that's at the hub of a lunar base to other HABs, to landers, rovers, etc. And even beyond. So whenever there's a market there, whenever there's an opportunity, we're excited about it and going after it.
What's the range?
So the range is very dependent on it's an architectural dependency, right? So the amount you can focus energy over distance is constrained by a couple of fundamental physics constraints, namely the conservation of étendue, which is a really fancy French way of saying like the conservation of light momentum, and diffraction. So you can think of our systems as basically reverse telescopes, and the amount that we can keep that beam focused over distance is driven by how large the final aperture is. The power nodes that we're baselining for low Earth orbit can reliably deliver energy at up to about 2,000 kilometers away from the spacecraft. If you were to deploy that system in a lunar application, obviously the curvature of the moon would make that distance not really relevant. So we would use smaller apertures, in a more cost-effective configuration to deliver power within line of sight.
What is the size of your constellation in Earth orbit?
So the size of the ultimate size of the constellation is really only limited by demand, right? So today, for context, there's about 50 megawatts of power generation on orbit today. By the end of the decade, excluding orbital data center ambitions, we anticipate there being a need for about 1,000 megawatts. We could provide initial coverage of everywhere in low Earth orbit all the time to be able to provide power anywhere in LEO with providing about 20 megawatts. Take about 200 satellites to do that. But then as there's more demand and more need, we layer more assets in, create denser coverage, and go from there.
Mm-hmm. You use the generic word orbit, and I immediately think of geostationary, but there's no reason you couldn't put it in lunar orbit and service observation communication satellites in lunar orbit. You can also come in there and be fairly low down and basically supplies extra power to Starlink. But there's a point where the atmosphere is not, it doesn't go from one atmosphere to zero. There's a certain amount of air drag in there. And when you get to the low orbit, how far down into the atmosphere can you fire it?
Yeah, so I think Joe maybe mentioned a little bit earlier our friends at Overview Energy that are focused on the space to ground energy transmission. More power to them, but we really don't like dealing with the atmosphere. The atmosphere is great at keeping you and I alive. It's terrible for power beaming, right? It absorbs, it scatters, all these sorts, and to say nothing of the state, local, federal, and international regulations you need to clear in order to have that system be sustainable and sustained.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going.
Yeah. So for all those reasons, we just stay above the Kármán line. That's our approach.
Okay. So
Do you make your own satellites, and how far back of an older satellite can you power before they're too old to do what you're talking about?
So we're taking that very kind of crawl, walk, run approach to the fielding of our satellites. The first couple of satellites, we will rely on other folks to build the satellite bus. But once we get to the full up power node, we'll be performing make buy decisions at the subsystem level, and then owning the design and integration of them and building them ourselves. In terms of how old of a satellite can we service, age really isn't the limit for us. It's really about what about the kind of capability that they need. There are folks like OrbComp, for example, that have a satellite constellation that was originally designed for 5-year operations, that now they're just they're nursing those satellites along into their 13th year. And so folks like that, giving them additional power so that they can have their satellites operate more at kind of the beginning of life availability they had versus the stretching is something that we're able to do.
John?
Yep. I was your comment earlier about the ITAR and all that led me to think about national security issues and potential adversary issues. You also mentioned you didn't want to burn out somebody's solar panels by putting too much energy on them. So could this same technology be used by either the Space Force or an adversary capability, not your company, but just their own, the analogous, to attack, you do ASAT attacks to knock out their power supply with laser?
So, my first space company that I had the pleasure of running was Made in Space, and we did a fair amount of work with robotics in space.
Mm-hmm.
And robots are awesome. And that robotic arm is something that you can use to build something in space, something you can use to take something apart in space.
Mm-hmm.
At Made in Space, we were very focused on the building. We weren't really concerned about the other bit. And that's always been kind of the approach with the companies that I've had the pleasure of running is we view what we're doing as an enabler of something to enhance the capabilities of others to provide. And from a national security perspective, I'm very, very interested in the fact that this provides an additional layer of resiliency for our national security spacecraft. That if someone were to damage the solar arrays or batteries of, say, satellites in the Space Development Agency's constellation, the tracking layer, well, we can, for the first time, just put more flux on that spacecraft's solar arrays, and then enable them to stay in the fight. And so those are the sorts of things from a national security perspective that this can have a lot of impact on.
I just was thinking that not that you would be doing this, but just that the technology you're talking about technologies always have positive and negative potential uses. I was thinking the negative use would be that most people think of ASATs as something that creates a lot of space debris, that you don't want. This would be a way where the satellite would just lose its power capability and would still be floating just like a satellite, intact and not debris per se. That was what I was thinking. Somebody might use the same concepts and go, I have an evil idea here.
That's a very interesting idea, John.
Okay.
In addition to needing a launch license for today, what regulatory requirements are there? And what do you anticipate there being by the time you're operational?
So we're subject to the same regulatory regime as every satellite that is launched from the U.S. or owned and operated by a U.S. Operator. So we've had lots of so we're in the midst of all those for our first satellite. We're in the midst of all those application processes right now. So FCC, FAA, NOAA, because we have a camera that can see things in space, and of course they have a consultative functionality with folks like Laser Clearinghouse and others. And so we spend a lot of time proactively educating those folks about what we do and the ways that we have built into the system safety measures to be a good neighbor, to provide our service consistently. And when we get to scale, it'll be the same broad regulatory regime that we'll operate in.
Who are your competitors?
So I like to think of the landscape as kind of a market map that power beaming is something that folks are using for space to space, space to ground. Those are the two areas people really focus on. So we've been talking a little bit about overview energy. Overview is doing space to ground. It's a really, really great team over there that we're good friends with. But they're not really directly competitive with what we are doing because they only have one wavelength. They're transmitting from geo all the way down. Their spot size is very, very large. They bathe the spacecraft and all of its buddies in light. Whereas, what you really need to do space to space is just land power on solar arrays, not on the whole spacecraft. And of course, you need to be a one-to-many system. You can have multiple beams you can steer independently of one another to provide power to multiple spacecraft. So space to ground, not really directly competitive. There have been a few firms since we announced our, the rounds that we've raised and the success we've had that have, kind of come out of the woodwork. And, it's kind of, it's nice to have, what's the saying? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So it's nice to have a few folks doing that. And then, of course, China has very explicitly said they not only have ambitions in space-to-space power beaming, but have had some success. There was an article in the China Times less than a month ago, where they announced some quite successful ground demonstrations. Not quite as the long distances that we've done, but with the Chinese government pushing that technology, which won't be competitive with us in the commercial markets, but certainly from a national security perspective keeps us motivated to push things forward.
What are your timelines for operations? Are you on time? Are you late? How do you forecast that out?
So our go forward plan is our go forward plan is to launch a series of demonstrator satellites getting us into operational capacity, and then by the end of the decade have full commercial capacity, start having commercial service, excuse me. I'm pleased to say we have a very high say-do ratio. We said, hey, we're building a satellite this year, it'll be ready to launch, and that is the case. Our first satellite, which we'll talk more about in the coming months as we get closer to launch, we actually delivered the flight hardware there, so we're quite proud about that. And then we'll follow that up with an operational prototype that'll fly, a couple of years later, and then scale from there.
Dallas, welcome to the show, but we have about 25 minutes left. It's a shorter show today than usual. In case you want to jump in, I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Per the comment I made to you before the show started, and what I hear all the time on All In podcasts is, first of all, they're in orgasmic heaven with data centers in space. Okay, and Elon and his plan, and everybody's got a plan, and they don't have to deal with the regulatory environment of power on Earth, which it's almost impossible. Community after community is voting to block data centers because they don't understand them. Some people think the Chinese are influencing that. I don't know one way or the other, but what is your take on this? Are you going to be a role player in it? And then I told you about Dan Dreyfus coming on and saying, look, we can't produce the energy to do any of this because of the critical stuff that's just not available. He talked about copper, molybdenum, hard for me to pronounce that one, and others, whether it's terrestrial or in space. So what's your take on what we're facing, regardless of where the data center may be, with opposition as well as shortages in what we need to make the data centers in the first place?
Yeah. I think that what we're building at Starcatcher is an enabler for orbital data centers. And I think it's something that relieves pressure on supply chain that we are experiencing with critical mineral shortages and potential critical mineral shortages. I've been in briefings with folks in DC talking a lot about the shortages that exist in those markets and how prices have gone way up for minerals necessary to manufacture solar arrays. And one of the things that we're the way that we're helping to alleviate that supply chain issue is because we can deliver more concentrated energy to a client satellite, to their solar arrays, so that they can fly smaller solar arrays, and still have the same power levels that they desire. Now, on the orbital data center front, we've actually put out a case study about how impactful power beaming is for orbital data centers, and the bumper sticker is you can get basically 3 data centers for the price of 1 if you leverage modern thermal control and power beaming, which is really amazing. Almost every orbital data center startup that exists in the market has signed a letter of intent or a power purchase agreement with us, because they recognize the importance of power beaming to their business models. StarCloud, Thero, many others have partnered with us in various ways. So we're quite excited about that. I mean, and more broadly, I do think that orbital data centers are really interesting, and but we need to look at it through kind of a crawl, walk, run lens that we all know, like today, like it is just a fact that today people are flying GPUs in space. Like, we're doing high-speed compute on orbit. And as we put more and more telecommunication layer in space, the industries, the technologies, the services that benefit from being proximal to a telecommunications layer, I think will naturally move to space. And so that's why one of the, I believe, strongest markets for data centers in space are content distribution networks and inference. So that when my home internet, because I have Starlink at home, when I say, hey, I want to watch some YouTube video, it goes up to the Starlink satellite and then over to an orbital data center, CDN, and pulls down whatever I want to see, and then sorts that back down to me. That's what we do terrestrially right now. And as we rely more and more on that infrastructure layer, it makes sense for that to be based there. And the same thing with inference, right? I don't want to wait any longer than I have to for Claude to tell me, provide me some insight. Now, is it going to be cheaper to build a data center in space in absolute dollars than it is on the ground in 2 or 3 years? Absolutely not. Is it going to be like cost parity in a decade? Well, if we build enough infrastructure in space, yeah, probably will be. And that's awesome.
But it won't have the political opposition. Like, they blocked one in Boulder, Nevada, which is where the dam is. And they put out a petition to block them from 100% in Nevada. And I know Joe has talked about it in his neck of the woods in California, and I read about it in others. So the cost, and they may not be relevant if you've got oppositions to doing it, kind of like what stopped nuclear development in the United States from decades ago.
No, absolutely. That's another angle here, right? And that you can underwrite this sector by saying, hey, we can overcome these regulatory issues that we face terrestrially. Now we've seen tech reshape entire regulatory regimes, right? If you think about the taxi medallion regulatory regime that existed, not like it was alive and well 10 or 15 years ago, that Uber and Lyft have totally reshaped. I think underwriting ODCs or underwriting orbital data centers on, hey, we can overcome regulatory issues is maybe a weaker underwriting. But it's certainly a consideration.
So when are you going to be operational? And then I'll turn it over to Dallas and Marshall.
So our second satellite will be the first satellite that is being useful, sellable power. But the real, having kilowatts of, tens of kilowatts, hundreds of kilowatts of energy delivery will be before the end of the decade.
Marshall?
one of the huge economic factors is going to be how long will one of your power satellites last? They talk about, house solar panels, being good for 20 years, and then they turn around, it's 25, and now there's a few that are talking 30. How long do you project they will last? And hey, the economics of, longer lasting cells.
Yeah. Yeah, no, our baseline we're baselining at least 10 years for our power nodes for an operational life.
Mhm.
Dallas.
And Andrew, good to see you. I was reading a document, so I got hung up and forgot about the time. But I've been having discussions with Gary Barnhart about power beaming in space for a number of years, maybe decades, and I still don't quite understand the benefits. You're collecting solar energy, you're transferring it to transferring it to a laser, right? And you're beaming it to satellites that have solar arrays that could just collect sun anyway. What's the benefit? I just don't get it yet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, Dallas, I appreciate the question. And it's good to see you too. So the core there's a lot of core benefits because as you and I know, um, if you want more power, if you want more local power generation on a spacecraft, it is not just bolt more solar array onto it. It's the systems engineering doom loop reigns supreme. That if we put bigger solar arrays on our spacecraft, we need bigger reaction wheels, we need more structure, and on and on and on.
Right.
And that's why you have a 1 kilowatt satellite costs $4 or $5 million from an Apex. A 20 kilowatt satellite at best in the market right now costs $15 or $20 million. And similarly, similar dramatic jump in launch costs associated with that. What we do by beaming more concentrated energy to the client satellite breaks that paradigm. Is that you can take a 1 kilowatt of solar array, and I can put 10 suns of flux on it and make it a 10 kilowatt solar array. And you can stay in the same form factor. Now, obviously, you have to make sure you have the appropriate thermal control on the asset and all those sorts of things. But where we are today is payloads have gotten more power dense and more power hungry. And you can kind of fly in the same form in an ESPA class form factor and a medium small satellite form factor, but you're power starved. And so we break that paradigm for folks. And so that's the big fat part of the value proposition. The other parts of the value proposition are, being able to have power all the time, regardless of the inclination of your orbit, right? There's only if you're above about 1,450 kilometers and you're in dawn dusk SSO, you always see the sun.
Right.
Every single other orbit in LEO has some eclipse,
Right.
Including dawn dusk SSO below 1450. So that's a real concern. And that's why our modern spacecraft design, or I shouldn't even say our modern spacecraft design, our spacecraft design is a paradigm of solar array and battery and living off of that. Versus every other thing that we interact with from a design perspective is we have battery backup,
Right.
Or diesel generator backup for my house, but I'm relying on the grid and I'm not concerned. I'm not concerned that my kids are playing their computers and I'm playing mine and if I have to turn something off and on. But that's what we deal with all spacecraft design. Of course the other areas are one of the other big ones is life extension, right? One of the major limb facts for spacecraft is, getting to that end of life power level, the batteries degrade, the solar arrays degrade, and you got to retire the spacecraft. If I put two suns of flux on the solar array of a spacecraft that's 10 years old, even if the solar array is half as efficient, I can get it back to beginning of life power level. We can extend the lifetime of it.
Yeah.
And, people love to talk about satellites being, disposable or whatever. But at the end of the day, these are multi-million-dollar pieces of capital equipment. We're going to squeeze the life out of them for as long as people have bridge ports that are 50 years old. We'd love to have satellites that are that old too.
So are you reaching into the shadowed regions as well?
Yes.
How are you doing that?
Yeah. So just as an example, I can fly a power node. So we fly our power nodes at 1,500 kilometers in altitude.
Okay.
So, so if we put what we call a power band, so 8 or 10 satellites in a like a dawn dusk SSO at
Right.
1,500 kilometers, I'm always sunlit. And then and my operational radius is about 2,000 kilometers.
Mhm.
So I can beam energy into inclinations that are plus or minus like 6 or 7 degrees,
Right.
and be able to provide energy to folks when they are in eclipse, going into or coming out of eclipse as well. And so those are the ways that we can, like fundamentally change the way we do spacecraft design.
Right. Appreciate the answer. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
So I was wondering about, like, if you've done link budget from like photons in to your satellite, your node, I think you called it, all the way down to electrons out of your customer's solar panel, and then what's the efficiency in that link budget? Can you share some information about that?
Yeah. So the key lens actually to look at for these sorts of things isn't a link budget in that sense. It's really a cost efficiency. And what we're doing is by being shared infrastructure, we can spread the costs out over many different spacecraft. And we believe we can sustainably sell power to folks at a fraction of what it costs for them to buy incremental watts from a traditional solar manufacturer when you amortize the cost over their operational life. But to give you some technical feel for it, I was talking a little earlier about diffraction. And what that ends up meaning is that when you're relatively close to us, like within about 500 kilometers, for every about 9 out of every 10 photons that we emit will land on a client spacecraft solar ring. Now, at our operational radius of a couple thousand kilometers, we chose that operational radius because the light begins to spread out so much that you're only landing like 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4, let's say, photons on the client spacecraft solar.
Joe?
But that's sorry, that's just a tiny part of the link budget. You got to like consider, your solar panels efficiency, then the efficiency of converting the power to the laser. Then you talked about the laser being able to focus and get, I think you said, a large percentage of the photons to hit the solar panel, and then of course the efficiency of that. So I'm talking end to end when I ask my question, not just like one small piece of the link budget.
Yeah, no, and overall, we're like because of the way we're collecting energy, the efficiency that we have in our lasers, our system is sufficiently efficient for us to be able to profitably deliver energy to folks at less than what you're buying solar arrays for.
Joe? You're muted.
Sorry. I was thinking about this and doing a little rock on the side. And one of the things I thought about this is this might be a way to avoid having nuclear reactors on the moon. In that if you put a bunch of these satellites, and it's a small bunch actually, into an orbit around the moon, like 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers above the surface, they would be in sunlight almost all of the time. And since lunar orbits are slow, you don't actually need that many satellites to do this. So you could actually beam power down to your base at the South Pole, which is, going to be screwed for 14 days because, like that's the way it is living on the surface of the moon. The moon is a much better application for this than Earth orbit, because in Earth orbit, even if you have eclipses, okay, they're not that long generally for most satellites. And satellites have batteries anyway for lots of other reasons, and that sort of thing. But you're not going to put enough batteries on the moon to actually keep your base running for 14 days, which is why everybody says they need a nuclear reactor up there, and stuff like that. But if you could do this from lunar orbit to the ground, or the surface on the moon, that actually strikes me as that's a really good application of this technology.
So, Joe, this is an application that I actually really am excited about. There's a NASA concept called Opal that came to similar conclusions as you and Grok did, but took a longer time to write. Um, and it's and it does take, if you want to provide power to a South Pole area, 3 or 4 satellites ends up being like an interesting, like a constellation size that works and is viable. Obviously, depending on how much power you want, that kind of stuff, it will flux up, and it'll flex up. Um, and yeah, I mean, you're hitting on something that, like, I am personally, like, passionate about. Is I think the way that you do survive the night isn't a boatload of batteries, and eventually it might be a nuclear reactor, but not right now. And power beaming is a solution for that. And even more so, this is something that is that can be just utilized by existing designs, right? Like Intuitive Machines, Firefly, Astrobotic, or the artist formerly known as Astrobotic, doesn't have to change the design. We can just beam energy to them, to their existing solar arrays. But this is also complementary to nuclear, right? That really what we're building is an energy distribution network. And right now we leverage the best fusion reactor in the solar system, in the sun. But if somebody were to just hand me a megawatt class, regulatory approved reactor with appropriate swap, we would rip off our solar concentrators and just plop that on the front of the spacecraft. And similarly, on the surface of the moon, you have a nuclear reactor. You can use power beaming to distribute that power to other HABs, rovers, landers in an adaptable and flexible way, compared to stringing power lines, on the surface of the moon.
Yeah, the other thing about having a 3 or 4 satellite constellation in some orbit that was servicing your base at the South Pole is you'd have a lot of time when those satellites weren't in range of the base, but were illuminated, which means you could hit all kinds of other random targets all over the moon, right?
Exactly.
Like everybody else who put something out on the moon that had some solar panels, you could hit their panels from those satellites during the off time when you're not supplying the base.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a energy grid for the whole moon.
Yeah. No, exactly.
That's exactly where I'm thinking along, and that's lunar rovers as well as Mars rovers, eventually Mars. Basically, don't have to have the big battery packs. They can use fairly small solar panels, and you would probably be able to hit them 99% of the time. You go through a tunnel or something, but it would basically be a complete power network for the moon. And you do, well, let's see, 4 make good coverage and 2 spares. 6 satellites do the whole job. Hey, that sounds extremely cheap.
Yeah, NASA Glenn studied that and presented on FISO, the Future in Space Operations Telecon, earlier this year. And Volta is looking at doing that as a business. Paul Danfus and company. So good ideas are being implemented.
Yeah. And the other thing that's really interesting here, Marshall, is that I get excited about is being able to beam energy into permanently shattered regions. That taking an LTV, taking an off-world rover, taking pick something, and like driving that down to the place where we think there's a lot of cool science and a lot of cool, like, resources for human expansion in space, and providing energy to it, right? Because right now, like, it's super cold and super dangerous to do that, and I think the baseline designs for NASA's LTV program is just like ridge running, right? They're not going in, they're not going down there. And we could via power grid, like we're talking about here, enable that. Now one and this is me talking as the CEO of a commercial space company, not as a guy that has Star Trek posters on his wall on when he goes on the space show. One of the key things here, though, is having a commercial sustainable market.
Right.
The reason that we're focused on low Earth orbit is in our view, there is a clear commercial case for power provisioning in LEO, and there's an install base of thousands of satellites that we can service. And now when there is a commercial, when I can close a commercial business case for building a lunar power grid, hell yeah, I'm going to go do that.
Yeah.
Right now, we don't have sufficient activity to that I can write a business case to do that. Now, but obviously, ignition and the moon-based plans and everything that NASA's driving is a really, really positive sign, like to enable that. And I hope that the fifth or sixth time I come on the space show, we're talking about, hey, there's a commercial case for this, and we're going after it.
Maybe by 2030. You said off-world. I don't know if you intentionally meant off-world company.
No, yeah, no, that was
We are going to
SCU.
We are going into PSRs, and we will need power.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's and like that's exactly the stuff that we want to be able to do. And the work that you all are doing at Offworld, is at the pointy tip of that spear.
Andrew, I know we're short of time because you're coming up on your eye. Three really quick questions. Have you decided on your pricing point, or where are you on figuring out pricing, and how are you going to do that? Can your beam be hijacked, and what are you doing for cyber and other nefarious actors that might be able to figure out a way to give you hell in orbit? And then if you are going to beam to the south pole of the moon inside a almost permanently shaded thing so that Dr. Doug doesn't go ballistic, what's your altitude above the moon?
Yeah. So from a pricing perspective, our model is to sell power like you buy power from your local power utility. And we aim for pricing that if you're buying it consistently from us is less than what the amortized cost of an incremental watt of solar power would be if you bought a solar array. Obviously, if you want, spiky, if you have variable demand or emergency service, those are all more premium services. To your question on the hijacking of the beam, this is a very good one. We are building in many safety techniques into our design to ensure that the beam isn't something that is harmful to folks, even if you do land it in a place that you don't want that it shouldn't be landed. And as we build out our operations on the ground, as we design the satellites, cybersecurity is something that we put a lot of energy into ensuring that we have good protection. And then the last question on the South Pole altitude, that's an open trade about how high we would be. As we've talked about here, there's a couple of different altitudes that you could use, depending on the kind of loiter time that you want.
Could someone take the beam and redirect it and hit an airplane flying in the atmosphere?
So it's a really narrow, a meter and a half across spot size is going to be super, super small. Like we won't even have, so you couldn't use it to damage a plane or something like that.
Does anybody have a real quick question to ask, or Andrew, do you have a concluding point that maybe we missed that we should know about before you say goodbye?
Yeah.
Any concluding thoughts from you, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I just like to say again, thank you for having me. It's always a great time, and thank you everybody for the questions and the dialogue. I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of give one last update and a little bit of call to action. So we've been very fortunate that we announced about a month ago our Series A. We raised $65 million. Our round was co-led by B Capital, Shield Capital, and Cerberus, and General J. Raymond joined our board, kind of founding general of the Space Force. And so we're very, very honored to have those folks as partners and to have General Raymond on our board. We're moving fast and growing fast on, building the next couple of satellites and expanding our commercial footprint. And so we are actively hiring. So that star-catcher.com/careers. We have some positions posted there. And also generally, if people get really excited about what we're doing, don't see a position that fits you perfectly, just apply or send something to info@starcatcher, and let us know, and we'll engage as we can. Because really having folks that get excited about this and can help build it, that's what we're all about.
Are you thinking IPO in the future or too far away?
It is. That's a good question. I've taken a space company public before. I believe the best kinds of space companies to be public are transformational founder CEO led companies. And that is what Starcatcher is.
So down the
Revenue would
road.
help.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and keep us posted when you have some new updates and you'd like to talk with us again. Please let me know, and happy to do it.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And thanks to John Jossie, John Hunt, Marshall, Dallas, Joe, Phil, and the people at your company and your publicist, Karen, who helped make all of this possible. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Everybody, keep looking up. Happy Father's Day to all of you. And Tuesday is a wide open show date, given last minute change of plans by Dr. Zabukin. And everybody, again, good holiday weekend. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you. See you.